Good morning and welcome to this Business Day Dialogues Live, a session in association with the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. I hope you're having a beautiful Thursday morning like I am here in sunny Pretoria. And it's election season. The local government elections are upon us. We have seen the posters go up. We've seen all the interesting social media videos by the different political parties. We've seen the GOVs as well. We've heard the GOVs. And we've also seen all the political parties signing the IEC Code of Conduct. Today, we want to focus our conversation on voter mobilization. What will voters do on election day? And we are talking about making voting appealing to South African non-voters. You know, we could focus all the attention on those who will go out and vote on voting day. And indeed, we will get all the data at the end of the elections to say how many people, what percentage of the population went out to vote. But crucially, we do need to talk about those that do not vote and why it is that they do not vote and what can be done to encourage them to vote. We all know that voter turnout does say something about the health of our democracy. And I am Nompumelelo Runji. I'm going to be taking us through this morning. I'll be moderating the discussion this morning with a very able group of panelists and experts. But before I get into that, I want to welcome Nomsa Masuku, project manager at the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, just to welcome all of us and just to, give us a sense of why this conversation is so important for us to be having. Welcome, Nancy.
Thank you, Nompumelelo. Good morning, everyone. I welcome you on behalf of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. Konrad Adenauer Stiftung is one of 6 German political foundations that are currently operating in South Africa. The concept of a political foundation might be something unique to Germany. All major political parties represented in parliament have their own affiliated foundation that share their values but are operating independently and are not funded by the political parties. Their mandate mainly lies in training and civic education, as well as in providing funding for scholarships, research, and publications. The system of political foundations goes back to the time after the Second World War, when Germany took a decision to invest in its reconstruction, especially in terms of strengthening the young multi-party democracy. Apart from the work in Germany, CAR started international cooperation more than 50 years ago. Currently, we are working in more than 100 countries worldwide, together with local partners, focusing on promoting democracy, good governance, and strengthening the rule of law. The topic of today's dialogue, voter mobilization, making voting appealing to non-voters, fits very well with our work, and it takes place at the right time, exactly 17 days to election day. However, the elections come at a time when there's general unhappiness in our country, the effects of the pandemic, job losses, the July unrest, and never-ending stories of corruption. Therefore, it is not surprising that some voters are disillusioned with politics and may choose to abstain from voting. But we hope that through this dialogue, we'll be able to encourage someone to go and vote on the 1st of November. We are really spoiled for choice. We have about 325 parties that are contesting, and we also have 1,700 independent candidates. So we really have a lot to choose from. Even if you may be frustrated or disappointed by your party of choice, please exercise your civic duty, switch your vote instead of throwing your vote away. I would like to take this opportunity to thank our esteemed panelists and our moderator for taking time today to share their insights with us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nancy, for giving us the context within which this election is taking place. And thank you so much for the contribution of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung in supporting and promoting democracy. In South Africa, we have a vibrant multi-party system. But let me just begin by introducing our esteemed panelists this morning. We've got Dr. Collette Schulz-Herzenberg, and she is senior lecturer at the Department of Political Science at Stellenbosch University. We've also got Dr. Nomsa Masuku, who is commissioner at the Electoral Commission of South Africa, better known as the IEC. We are so grateful to have you on, Dr. Masuku. We've got Hajra Omarjee, a political editor at Business Day, who's going to be sharing her insights this morning. We've also got Minaj Jinnah, executive director at My Vote Counts, a very important organization when we're talking about issues of voting and voter mobilization. And just to start us off as we begin to unpack this idea of non-voting in the South African context. I wish we were having this discussion actually just pre-registration, because maybe we could have encouraged a few more people to go and register, but of course registration is now closed. But let's hope that we can encourage those who have registered and are thinking about not showing up to show up on the day. So we're going to ask Dr. Collette Schulz-Herzenberg to just sort of set the scene for us by running us through the registration data she's collected over the last couple of years. She's written a lot about this and done a lot of studies on this question of voters and voter participation in the South African context. And she is going to help us to understand what the picture actually looks like at the moment and give us some sort of historical comparisons as well. Welcome, Dr. Collette. Please go ahead and take the stage.
Good morning, everybody. I trust you can hear me and also see a few visuals. Can somebody just confirm?
Yes, we are seeing the visuals.
Thank you. Good morning to all my panelists and to those of us who have joined today. Thank you for joining. I thought it would just be useful just to set the scene in terms of understanding voter participation in South Africa at municipal elections primarily, because that's where our focus is right now, but also to then compare that to what's been happening at national and provincial elections. And we need to start by just understanding the growth in the voting age population in South Africa. And that's indicated in this graph in the blue line. We can see that there's been a significant growth in the amount of voters in South Africa. And currently we're at, in 2021, we sit at around 38.5 million eligible voters. So we can think of these people as citizens of our country who are 18 years and above, who are eligible to vote. And also just to add that this data comes directly from Statistics South Africa, which also supplies exactly the same data to our electoral management body, the Commission. And so we can see this ongoing growth in the voting age population. And then just below that in the red line, this is an indication of the numbers in millions estimated of registered voters. And what we can see is that, in fact, registration has kept pace with the growth in the voting age population. But suddenly we see in 2021 a drop-off in registration for municipal elections. In fact, it's somewhat lower than it was for the previous 2016 election. And I would refer to this as the registration gap, which now currently sits at around 2.4 million people who are not registered to vote. So this is something that is obviously slightly different to what we've seen in previous municipal elections and something that we probably need to discuss. And then under that, in the green line, we can see overall turnout in millions, in fact, keeping pace quite nicely with the growth in registration and so forth. And of course, after the election, we will be able to complete that section of the graph. And now what I wanted to do, in fact, is just to take you to the next slide, which is our national elections. The same data tracking since 1994, our first democratic election, right up to the previous 2019 national and provincial elections. And we see here again, as we would expect, it's the same electorate, that growth in the voting age population, and registered voters more or less keeping pace. But what we have seen there is about 1.5 million voters adding to that registration gap. So that registration gap is widening. And again, we see this overall turnout decline suddenly around 2019. And that would lead me to suspect that we're going to see a similar pattern in the municipal election, but let's not preempt. This is a graph that just really swaps the numbers from millions into percentages, just to give us a sense of percentages. And here we see that the municipal elections have done rather well, of course, with their voting age population that is registered. And it peaked in 2016 with 77% of all eligibles registered to vote, and then suddenly drops off in this current election. And again, of course, turnout has in fact increased over the past several local government elections. And this is very encouraging, but perhaps just to point out that it is from a very small base. And of course, what we do need to do is think about turnout in two different ways. We talk about turnout as a proportion of registered voters, and this is our red line indicating around 58% of registered voters cast a vote in the 2016 municipal election. But in fact, a more accurate way of measuring a voter turnout globally, in fact, is by understanding that proportion in terms of eligible voters in the country, of all our eligible voters, whether they're registered or not, who cast a vote. And that has actually moved up in local elections, but sits at just under half the population at 45%. And now I just, again, want to compare this to what's been happening at the national level. And here we have a dramatically different story. We can see that the bottom lighter blue line, in fact, shows our proportion of the voting age population casting a vote declining quite significantly over time, as well as the proportion of registered voters. And this really, shows us a very different picture emerging over national elections vis-a-vis municipal elections. And what I think we're seeing now is, if we sort of move between the two graphs, that in terms of the voting age population casting a vote, national is in fact almost as low now as provincial elections. So that just gives us a sense or a summary of what's been happening in the electorate over time since 1994, and also across our municipal elections, and then comparing those to national.
Thank you so much, Dr. Collette, for setting the scene there with those figures. It does look to me that the story is becoming bleak, in the sense that we seem to have been very enthusiastic about elections at the beginning of our democracy, and it seems to be tapering off. And one of the questions I'd like to ask is whether that is in line with general trends globally of voter turnout, whether we measure it by the number of people who actually turn up to vote versus those registered, or whether we use the voting age population measure. Is this normal to see it sort of tapering off the way it is? But before we get into that discussion, I just want to remind all those who are viewing that you are actually able to ask questions. I'm sure looking at those graphs has made you think about things, and you want to make comments and you want to ask questions. Please just use the portal provided for you to type in your questions, and we will try to engage them. Dr. Collette, before you take us through some of the questions that have come up from your presentation, I want to bring in Dr. Nomsa Masuku, and just to ask the question about the readiness of the Electoral Commission to conduct elections under the context, of course, of the COVID pandemic, the lockdowns that we've had, and of course against the backdrop of the findings of Justice Dikgang Moseneke's commission investigation around the postponement of the elections, and of course the Constitutional Court finding that we should proceed with elections. How has all of that played into the IEC's ability to run a free and fair election, and what have been some of the challenges in terms of preparing for this local government election in comparison to previous elections? Dr. Masuku?
Thank you very much. And once again, thank you to all our audience and my fellow panelists. I'm going to try and be very brief. It's difficult to be brief about matters of court, but I will try. I think it's very important to frame why it is that the Moseneke process happened in the first place. It happened because I would like to remind all of us that South Africa created something called the Party Liaison Committee structure. That is where all contestants in an election sit. They don't make decisions, but they're an advisory body to both the executive committee and more importantly to the commission. When you talk about the commission, we talk about the 5 people that are commissioners. And normally we use those structures in order to get political parties mainly and whoever else is contesting to come to some kind of agreement on things. When COVID hit us, for the first time, I think, in the history of election management in South Africa, we could not get the party liaison committees to agree. You had 2 diametrically opposed schools of thought. You had those that said that having an election is going to endanger lives. And you had those that said that the elections have to proceed regardless. Now, I might just remind all of us that there were 3 contesting rights. According to the Constitution, we are supposed to have regular elections, but also those elections must be free and fair. But not only that, they must happen in an environment that does not endanger life and limb. So those are the contesting 3 things. So what do you do? The people that wanted an election to happen tended to focus primarily on the regularity of elections. They say it's 5 years is over, we are done, let's have the election. And those that did not want to have the election were using the danger to life and limb, which then ties in with the inability to have free and fair elections. But this group especially, they also spoke to their inability to campaign. And they said you cannot declare an election free and fair if we have not had unfettered access to our voter bases. Now, it was the first time that we could not get these 2 sides to come together. So we invoked Section 14(4) of the Electoral Commission Act, which says that the Commission can issue a report that speaks to the likelihood of an election being free and fair. That is how we came about it. Now, remember that the Electoral Commission is a Chapter 9 institution. Our natural inclination is to do what the Constitution says. So our natural inclination is that we are going to run elections at the time, it was the 27th of October. However, we have to do so with the cooperation of the people that are going to contest. So we're faced with a dilemma. The former Deputy Chief Justice came on board, had all the views. We were mindful that every person must be heard, and that's what the Mseneke process did. The Mseneke process came out, and of course, as you know, it then recommended that we will not be able to declare elections as free and fair in those conditions, and said that we should approach a competent court. But the Mseneke the recommendations said that the difference between October and the recommended February was the number of people that would be vaccinated. So it didn't say that we could predict with any certainty of where we would be in terms of the pandemic. Would we have a 4th wave? Would we not have a 4th wave? We wouldn't know. So that is what happened. We approached the Constitutional Court, and as you know, the Constitutional Court said that go ahead with the election, have it within the 90-day frame. And what happened then is that the court ordered, it just handed down its order without reasons. So for a lot of time, people were trying to figure out why the Constitutional Court had decided what. And there was a lot of arguments about whether the Electoral Commission was reading the order correctly by saying that it would open candidate nomination. So to answer your question much more directly, this has changed the way that we organize an election. It takes us about 2.5 years to prepare for an election. It is a process that I always try to use the analogy of a train. The train has got many carriages, and once the train starts moving, it keeps on moving. If you try and remove one carriage, it's going to affect the other carriages. So from where we sit as the Electoral Commission, it is very important that we go through all of those steps. Like for example, making sure that there is registration. I'd like to remind people that the scientists had told us that the third wave was going to taper off in July, before July. And as you know, come July, we're at the peak of the third wave. And the scientists, people say that they got something wrong. I also think that they are dealing with something that is a moving target. So when we came to July and we're supposed to have registration, we're slap bang in level 4, lockdown level 4. Now, during lockdown level 4, there's very little that you can do, not just as contestants, but as the Electoral Commission. So that is why the registration weekend was then moved. Because what we're trying to look for is to look for a window when we could have a registration weekend and it would be safe to do so. Safe for voters, but also safe for our own staff. The story that is not usually told is the rate of infection inside the Electoral Commission as an organization. We had massive infections across the organizations, which compromised our ability to even go out and have the election. So it has changed the way that we organize elections, because you are dealing with something that you can't control. You are dealing with, for example, a state of disaster that is not managed by the Commission. You are dealing with, the Electoral Commission does not determine what level of lockdown you are going to have. That is a new consideration that we have to do. So we have to run between the persons that determine the lockdown levels, determines the regulations, and try and say to them, please look into your crystal ball and let us know when we can have what activity. And so that has really changed the dynamic completely. So the certainty that we've always had as an Electoral Commission when we run elections was shaken.
Yes.
And it still is shaken.
Yeah. Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Masuku. I think it was really important for us to allow Dr. Masuku to just give us that background as to the unique situation that the IEC finds itself in. We are talking voter mobilization, and as we continue with this discussion, we might want to reflect on how that an arguably unique context that the pandemic has brought about has had an effect on these graphs that Dr. Collette had just presented to us. I want to move on to you, Hajra, and just to really think about the way that Dr. Collette has set the scene for us. And I mean, it is great and it is good and well to see all those numbers and to see the fluctuations, but I think it's important to get to now the nub of why do we see, this voter registration gap? Why are we seeing more and more people over the last elections staying away from the polls? And from your perspective, you're on the ground, you're reporting on this. What are your reflections on that?
So everything that the IEC told us through Dr. Nomsa this morning, and everything that Dr. Collette told us through the data she presented, speaks to a growing trust deficit between political parties and between the electorate and political parties. It's interesting that the party liaison committee did not agree for the first time in 27 years of democracy. And if my information is correct, the split was 10-4. And it speaks to a greater problem of politicians and political parties not talking to each other, but talking at each other, in many cases just for political opportunism. But other than that, if you read the data that Dr. Collette presented very, very closely, it speaks to the lived experience of South Africans and whether when they vote, that vote actually amounts to a change in their own lived experience. For some time now, the data has been telling us that South Africans are not responding to political parties, but political parties have not been listening. If you look at the change of guard in the city of Cape Town as far back as 2006, or the change of guard in the city of Nelson Mandela Bay, which we first saw the ANC drop in huge numbers in 2011, and then the change of guard in 2016. If you saw the ANC put former President Zuma on the faces of its posters in 2016, and how that was a needle in the eye of people of Atteridgeville and Soweto and Johannesburg, it tells you we have a real problem. That is why South Africans are not registering or voting perhaps in as large numbers as they used to, because of the trust deficit between ourselves, politicians and political parties. And I think that is a problem that needs to be addressed. Platforms like this will help us do it because we're talking to and not at each other.
That is a fascinating, the point that you make, particularly about how political parties are unresponsive to voters and the electorate. And I want to bring Minaj in here because there's been a lot said about young people and the fact that them not registering, them not voting is a sign of political apathy. And I, as well as, because I'm also a political analyst, I tend to differ slightly with that in the sense that it's young people that mobilize protests. It's young people that are involved in social movements and they're starting all these social movements. So what's the relationship, Minaj, in the work that you've done between this idea that young people are apathetic and what Hajra has just told us about this trust deficit and political parties really being unresponsive and not really being able to appeal to voters, and how does that reflect on this idea of youth and youth participation in voting?
Thanks. I agree, Nompumelelo. I agree that young people are not necessarily apathetic, and I want to make a couple of points. Some responding to the previous speakers. I think there are two crucial things that are emerging from these local government elections. The one is that there's an increase in independent candidates across the country. And I think more importantly, there's an emergence of communities and already established community organizations, community movements and structures putting forward their own candidates. Examples are in Bonteheuwel and the Cape Flats. The Bonteheuwel Development Forum has done this, has organized through street committees and put forward their own candidates. In Botshabelo in the Free State, which is the third biggest township in the country, the Unemployed People's Movement has put forward, I think, 8 candidates, both ward and PR candidates. And most prominently in Makanda, a municipality that has completely failed, was actually taken to court and put under administration, has put forward a number of both ward and PR candidates. I think this is crucial to understand how people in communities, working class communities in particular, are relating to local government, and I think it's important to watch. Secondly, I think that voters, young voters in particular, are not necessarily apathetic, are not necessarily apolitical. I think what we're also seeing is communities. Many communities are very consciously and vocally rejecting electoral politics. So there's this vocal rejection. About a month ago, Cyril Ramaphosa started the ANC's campaign trail by driving through Soweto on the back of a bakkie, and visited many areas in Soweto, and areas that have been deprived of electricity by Eskom. Some homes for weeks, some homes for days. Consistently for the past few years, there's been blackouts, and in almost every area in Soweto that Ramaphosa drove through, he was disrupted by activists, mostly whom were traditionally ANC supporters, who said they're not going to vote. They're rejecting their right to vote. Interestingly, Ramaphosa said next week Eskom is going to come and sort out the electricity. So that's important. Also, we're seeing activists in Tembisa, in Mamelodi, with a similar kind of sentiment. This rejection of electoral politics. We're not going to vote because services are not delivered. Another interesting study is in Bishop Lavis on the Cape Flats as well. The Bishop Lavis Action Community, which is a long-established community movement organized through street committees as well, has taken a decision to boycott elections, and has called for a new type of democracy from below. And most of their members are young people as well. And then I think for young people in the past few years have been particularly disenfranchised by the way our politics works or doesn't work. Youth unemployment is in a crisis. Only 1 in 4 young people are employed. School infrastructure is falling apart. It's not improving, and inequality is deepening, especially for young people. And on top of that, local government is in a deep crisis. Municipalities across the country are failing. According to the Auditor General report released last year, irregular expenditure amounted to 26 billion rand, around 26 billion rand. On top of that, we know that local government is unable to provide basic services in most municipalities. Municipalities are characterized by rubbish on the streets, overflowing of sewage, cuts in water and electricity, and starkly, we know that in South Africa, every single day there are tens of protests across the country, as you said, Nompumelelo, led by young people, and challenging local government power. I also agree with Hajra. I think there's a trend of mistrust in political parties in South Africa and globally. Yeah. And in this local government elections, we're seeing that political parties have been uninspiring. They're offering little alternatives, and corruption is deepening. Corruption Watch released a report a while ago that showed that young people understand corruption very deeply, and this understanding of corruption contributes to the mistrust. 80% of youth believe that government corruption contributes to the employment status, and therefore there's this mistrust in political parties as well.
Thank you so much, Manoj. I think what we're getting from what I'm hearing from you as a panelist is that, I mean, the reasons for non-participation in elections are actually quite complex and nuanced. And I want to go back to you, Dr. Collette. You've not only analyzed just the the numbers, and you've also gone into the attitudes of those who are not participating in elections. And I want to see whether what has been said so far is really mirrored in the data that you've come across as you've sort of analyzed why it is that people are staying away from the polls. What are the reasons that they're giving? What is the landscape provincially, age-wise as well? What are the differences there? and what are the motivations that make people not to vote?
Thanks. Yes, I think speakers have actually hit the nail on the head, to be perfectly honest. Hajra made the point about mistrust. Minaj has spoken about how young people are essentially disaffected. And there are a couple of issues that I think all pull this together that now feature quite prominently in the research that we've done. And the one is that, well, there are two main reasons why voter turnout is falling in South Africa. The one is because we have a young population. We have a youthful population injecting millions of new young voters into the electorate at every election. But if we look at the figures, and I can bring them up very quickly, we see that the registration rates amongst young people are incredibly low. And what this does, in effect, is leaves an imprint on the aggregate turnout rate in the country. If you know a vast proportion of our eligible electorate are not registering and not voting, this will inevitably bring the aggregate turnout rate down. Now, connected to this, we see something else happening, and it's largely driven by young people, but also by voters who were previously participants in the electoral system but have since withdrawn. So these are people who once cast a vote for a political party, for their traditional political home, but have started moving away from voting altogether, abstainers. And these people, you know, if we look at all the data together, what we're seeing is something quite alarming. Abstainers are disenchanted on two levels, if we can put it that way. One, they're disenchanted with political parties. So, for example, if I've been a traditional ANC supporter for a number of years, but I've grown disillusioned with the ANC and I want to shift my support away to a new political party, and an increasing number of voters are doing that, but that has to be based on very positive evaluations of other parties. And we see that the majority of South African voters are unable to assess other political parties positively. And we look at things such as competence, trust, representativity. Now, people get stuck here and say, well, what do you mean by representativity? A lot of South Africans use the racial makeup or the party image to understand very rationally what that party would probably do in office and whom they would represent. So we have some racial cueing going on in South Africa, but to a large extent, it's a very rational way of understanding, a shortcut of understanding what parties are likely to do in office, whom their constituencies are, who will they represent. And unfortunately, the vast majority of voters give negative evaluations on that, and therefore they are unable to find a credible, legitimate alternative, and therefore they abstain. But it also, what's emerging from the data is that abstainers are actually disaffected with the political system more generally. In fact, they're sitting at the periphery of electoral politics. They're not watching campaigns, they're not following political news, and they are not enticed by political parties. And we are finding a very strong correlation between that and levels of satisfaction with democracy more generally. That tells us that what's essentially happened is a prolonged period of discontentment with governance is starting to percolate and if you like, negatively affect people's commitment to electoral democracy. And that's a problem. So I think we need to understand that there are probably different things going on. This injection of young people is definitely suppressing turnout, and we can have a discussion as to why young people don't vote. We need to probably remember that this is a global phenomenon. It's not just a South African phenomenon. Young people have moved away from elections generally across the world, and there are plenty of reasons for that. They have a very different attitude around civic mindedness and so forth. They have different technologies and use different medias in terms of political news. And all of these things come together to actually sort of draw them away from elections. They're not mobilized by churches and trade unions as some of us older voters are. And at the end of the day, this is not a unique South African phenomenon. But I do think, as Minaj so rightly pointed out, that young people in South Africa are beset by a number of very difficult situations, particularly unemployment, difficulty accessing tertiary education and so on. And this has had a sort of an effect of sort of jaundicing their opinions about democracy. So all in all, I think, there's quite a bit to unpack here. And we need to really understand what's motivating young people in terms of, moving away from formal electoral politics. But I agree. I don't think young people are apathetic. They certainly care about politics. Yes. I think that there's just, they don't necessarily regard existing political parties, conventional political parties, as legitimate platforms right now.
Yeah, I think we've got a very interesting dynamic going on. I see Hajra wants to come in before I ask this question, because I want to move us now to solutions. Hajra, please go ahead.
Very quickly, what Minaj and Dr. Collette said speaks to a trust deficit in our constitutional democracy. In the July political insurgency, violent unrest, we saw what the alternative to our constitutional democracy would be, and that is majoritarian rule. And the IEC and political parties, like it or not, is the only thing that stands between us and that. So I think that is the context and why elections, as well as conversations like this, are so important.
Thank you so much, Hajra, for making that point, because I was going to now say, there's unfortunately, we were sort of in a dilemma, because we need electoral politics. We need to participate in electoral politics to affect governance, because that's the way we change who governs. That's the way we determine who governs. So if we're not participating, or people are not participating in electoral politics, or rejecting electoral politics, and that is the system through which we determine who governs. I mean, what is the alternative? How do we change the situation around? How do we change the mindsets around this? Because we don't want to get to what Hajra has just pointed to. We don't want to get to a situation where we have this majoritarianism, where we have the complete disintegration of society because of the failures of governance, and also because of a complete rejection of the political system. Can we start? I mean, I don't know, from your side, Dr. Nomsa, and electoral administration side of things, what do you think could be done?
Okay, thank you very much. I think I want to start by just latching onto a point. Usually, and I want to also just say that for me, the youth that I interact with, everything I do with youth also says that they're not apathetic at all. Okay. So, but what I keep hearing, I think needs a bit of unpacking of debate. People say that, no, you know what, but also, voting is not the only thing that you can do. They are participating because they organize protests. Now, to me, that feels like you're saying that I'm going to wait until I'm ill, and then I'm going to run to hospital and get fixed, when in fact I could have done things like I could have changed my eating habits. I could have exercised a little bit. In other words, the difference between being reactive and being proactive. And I think that what elections do is that you are in control of determining who is going to form government. And I do not know any other way that is available to us besides that. Secondly, the real danger with the phenomenon that Collette has described is that in South Africa, if people are not registering as voters, it also means they can't stand as candidates, because registration is a precondition for you to stand as a candidate. So what you have is that you have a knock-on effect on the fact that you are going to be unhappy because of the people that are running, are getting to government. But also there's nothing that you can do, because you yourself can't stand as a candidate, you can't form a political party, and all of those things. You can only support. So I think for me, it puts you on the back foot. But of course, someone would argue that. I would argue that obviously, because that's what I do. I run elections. It's almost like of course you're going to say that because you're the electoral commission. But I'm also a specialist in democracy development. And I think one of the things that is a problem is just that The second thing that I want to say is that what I've seen also increasingly is that as we have a multitude of contestants joining the fray, they attack the Electoral Commission as part of their campaign strategy. So in other words, if I can't fight anything else, I'm going to resort to saying that I've been robbed, and the IEC is against me and all of those things. That does not help. I am not saying that as an election management body, we are not guilty of making mistakes. It's a huge operation that you run on a single day. And you do find the most bizarre things happening in a voting station that people have not been trained to do. I'm not saying that doesn't happen, but what I'm saying is that increasingly people are making statements about the Electoral Commission that make a person who is listening think to herself, you know what, if the Electoral Commission itself, I can't even trust the Electoral Commission itself, never mind the politicians that are contesting. It just makes the trust deficit problem just a little bit more acute.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nomsa. I'm going to go to Hajra before I come to Manoj, because Hajra, you have gone on about this trust deficit thing, and I think it's time we tease it out a little bit, because you know, this idea that political parties, instead of spending more time trying to appeal to voters, spend more time attacking each other, attacking the IEC. I mean, can you speak to us a little bit about what can be done in terms of this trust deficit issue?
Not just attacking the IEC, but also attacking the Constitutional Court in recent weeks. And I think that speaks to the caliber of political parties. Now, let me issue a challenge to political parties and politicians. Why do they need to spend R1 billion or R100 on an election campaign if the public representatives which are elected into office in their name actually do their job? They won't have to spend any money, firstly. Secondly, 27 years into democracy, we are seeing a failure of the economic system, which includes a failure of the education system. If you have over half of South African youth being unemployed, it means your education system has failed. And we need to start taking governance seriously. And we should not attack the integrity of institutions, absolutely. But I don't think political parties take the national interest and governance as seriously as they do party political interests. However, what is the alternative? There is no alternative. It is anarchy. It is majoritarian rule. So we've got to, from this point forward, continue to try to do the right thing, put the country first, build the national interest, create ownership amongst the youth and all South Africans in our democracy, and ensure that the lived experience of South Africans is reflected in the election result. And on that note, I must praise the IEC, because I think we saw in 2009, in 1999, in 2016, in 2006, the election result was reflective of the lived experience of South Africans. It seems like political parties are the only ones who haven't read the data or the results from previous elections.
And who haven't read the temperature of the room. Manoj, please.
Because they are aloof, and,
Yes.
and they inherited the state from the apartheid government, and it's created a social distance once they're in high office between them and ordinary South Africans.
Yes, very important point, Hajra. Manoj.
Firstly, also to commend the IEC on how they've managed to maintain an electoral democracy, coordinate that part of our democracy. And 2 points. First, I think we need a deeper understanding of this thing called the vote and how it can be used. I think the vote is not necessarily to determine who must govern or who must be put in power, especially at local government level. It's also about saying who must not govern. It's also about sending a statement. It's also about protest. Professor Stephen Friedman makes this point using the example of Nkandla. After the Zuma upgrades in Nkandla, the ANC voters in Nkandla voted the ANC out to send a statement. Similarly, in a vote for the IFP, whom they wouldn't necessarily relate to or agree with. Similarly, in Nkandla. So I think we need to understand. I'm sorry, in Marikana. So I think we need to understand how the vote can be used beyond just putting people in power. And then I think, although there's general agreement that the problem is not necessarily a political apathy, voter turnout is an important marker of the health of our democracy. But I think the solutions and voter registration numbers is an indication of a weak democracy, I think. But fundamentally, the solution is not administrative. It's not technical. It's political. Yes, we need things like automatic registration. We need strengthened mechanisms of accountability. We need better communication, and we need to engage young people better. But technical solutions are not going to make electoral politics or local government more popular. More importantly, we need a political reimagination. We need to let go of the old because the old doesn't work. And we need a new politics that's genuinely rooted in people's struggles, in communities, in women's groups, in youth groups, in churches and mosques. We need new political players that listen and will bring new ideas and a progressive imagination. We need to organize and we need to build.
Thank you so much, Manoj. I also think that, a part of what the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung and the other German foundations really emphasize on is political education, civic education. And I think that's something that we need to begin to think about. How do we actually do it, and in a way that's appealing to young people? Dr. Collette mentioned the fact that the way young people engage and how young people mobilize themselves and the way they are mobilized is through different means, and technology is one of those means. And we and political parties and all of us as participants and as those who are interested in developing democracy and encouraging participation need to really think about meeting people where they are, using the communication systems that they use. Dr. Masuku, I'm going to come to you just now. I just want to just bring in some of the comments that we received and questions. And I'll do this in turn. We've got only a few minutes left, and I really want to give attention to some of these questions. We've got a question from Karen who says, to what extent do you think the uncertainty around when we would have the local government elections and COVID impacted on voter registration? Dr. Masuku, do you want to maybe respond to that also in relation to whatever it is that you wanted to say, if very briefly?
Okay. You know what, from where I sit, because registration is continuous, I don't think so. But of course, if people, the tendency is to say that I'm going to leave it until the last minute. So yes. If you leave it until the last minute, so a lot of people left it until the last minute. Those people that were hoping that the election would indeed be moved thought they had time. And when the ruling came, they did not have time. So I think that is something. But the thing that I also wanted to talk about is that the conversation that we're having needs to be a bit richer. It is when people frame democracy, they say that, but this democracy hasn't done anything for me. It hasn't. I'm sitting here and all voting, all that it is going to do is going to make someone else richer. And maybe the way that we sold democracy right from pre-1994, we are beginning to pay for that framing, saying that democracy does stuff for you. instead of democracy creates an environment where it takes away structural impediments. It takes away all of those things. It is an environment where you should expect to be able to live optimally and do all of those things. So I think the way that the messaging goes, vote for me, I will give you a house. Vote for me, I will do this. So what we are hearing in the airwaves is that what is the IEC doing about educating people? The role to educate certainly is shared by the Electoral Commission, no doubt about that. But it is everyone's job. We have to begin to talk about an environment where people are looking at what is that they are going to do for their own country, for their own health.
Yes, Dr. Masuku, I'm going to ask you to leave it at that now. There's a comment from Sheelan who says, why should people be expected to vote when we experience little to no services or economic growth? Why should people vote when we mostly have political parties to choose from? We need a more accountable electoral and political environment. And I think it just speaks to what Dr. Masuku just explained now. That's not about what democracy does for us, but the environment it creates for what we can do. And then I think this one is to you, Dr. Collette, I think still from Sheelan, who says, would it be better in terms of gathering data and democracy if disenchanted voters who would otherwise abstain to vote but purposely spoil their ballots? So basically, I think what she's asking is, what is better, to abstain or to spoil ballots?
Yes, thank you. I'm not a great believer in spoiled ballots because it actually doesn't change the status quo. It's a wasted vote. It doesn't change the proportionality of what the parties receive. Those votes are put aside, we record them, but yes, it's a protest of sorts, but it doesn't change the status quo. What we would rather do, and I'm actually very excited about this election because we have a number of independent candidates running. I think this is going to be a really interesting dynamic. Quite simply because life has become very raw at the local level. We are confronting municipalities that are not functioning well. We have these candidates who do not belong to political parties that are suffering trust deficits and so forth, who are going to possibly grab the imagination of local voters. So my argument would be, rather than waste your vote, find local candidates that can deal with and hold these institutions accountable at the local level. And I also just want to point out that although we have lamented the fact that so many young people are not registered, I just want to leave, from my side with one small figure. Of all the South Africans who are registered to vote on the 1st of November, 43% are between the ages of 18 and 39 years old. That is a phenomenal proportion of people who can cast a ballot on the day. And this really goes to Dr. Masuku's point. Elections are not about reward necessarily. It's also about punishment. It's a sanctioning device. And if you are not happy, don't spoil your vote or simply abstain. Find a legitimate candidate that you can live with for the next 5 years and hold them accountable.
Yes, and I just want to read something from Karen. We don't have time to really engage this point, but she's talking about the idea that maybe how we vote. She's talking about, voting online, for instance, whether that has any implication on encouraging people to vote. So maybe trying different ways or different technologies. I know both Dr. Masuku and Collette might have something to say on this, but we only have about a minute left. I don't know, Collette, do you want to just weigh in on that?
I think the Electoral Commission is better placed to talk, technicalities, but I understand online voting is a very complicated procedure and open to all sorts of fraud, etc., and can be very expensive.
Yeah. Dr. Masuku, anything on that?
Okay, I'm going to go back to what Minaj said, that the technical responses will help somewhat, but they are not really where I think we should be looking. Of course, from an electoral administration perspective, electronic voting would be great. But you don't launch electronic voting when the people that are contesting the elections are suspicious of the system, because they are going to refuse the result. They're going to reject the result because they are suspicious of what happens at the back end. So with levels so low of trust, I would not choose this moment to introduce electronic voting, even though continuously we're trying to urge Parliament to give the Electoral Commission some kind of facilitating law so that we can begin to go that direction.
Thank you so much to all of you for participating in this discussion. It is rich, it's complex, and it's very difficult to talk about this complicated issue in such a short period. But I think you've done such a great job of really unearthing for us, beginning to surface some of the key issues. And I hope that this discussion has been valuable to viewers and those of you who have registered and were thinking either of abstaining and or spoiling your ballot, that you will now go back and take some time to actually reflect on what the alternative could be, other than just not voting. I think the point has been made, and made very strongly, that voting is not just about rewarding, but really it's also a tool to sanction. It's also a tool to signal to political parties that they need to take the electorate more seriously, and that we will use the power that we have. And that power right now in this season, 17 days to go before the election, lies in our vote. And so we need to use that power that we have. And of course, also remembering that our role doesn't end as voters at the end of voting day. We continue to be citizens, and we need to engage with our local government. There are processes that will take place. There are IDP processes, integrated development planning, and we need to begin to retake these platforms that have been hijacked by political interests. And so thank you so much to Hajra. Thank you so much to Minaj. Thank you, Dr. Collette. Thank you, Dr. Nomsa, for your insights this morning. Thank you so much to the Business Day Dialogues Live for arranging this in association with the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, that is very committed to these to promoting democracy. And thank you so much to our viewers who have participated. The questions and the comments that you made were really valuable. And we hope that to see you soon again when we have another one of these sessions, and have yourselves a wonderful day further. And hopefully you will go out there and use your power on voting day. Thank you.